Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to another seminar. So it's my pleasure today to introduce the seminar for this afternoon, Dr. Spencer Schubert, who has a very rich background in tropical forest ecology and restoration in many parts of Latin America. His field experience is focused primarily on tropical plants and their seed dispersers, with an emphasis on how these interactions impact conservation and ecological theory. Spencer currently holds a postdoctoral position in University of California, Santa Cruz, where he collaborates with Dr. Karen Hall. In this role, Spencer is working on developing the restoration research program in Costa Rica by analyzing data from long-term experiments, and also by analyzing and studying how NGOs across the world apply or do the practice of restoration and reforestation. Spencer holds a PhD degree from Old Dominion University, and his dissertation focused on tropical plant frugivore networks in the Dominican Republic, where he spent several years. This work investigated the influence of plant phenology on the dynamics of seed dispersal, but also advanced on understanding of the links between seed dispersal and forest restoration in human-modified landscapes. An important element that has allowed Spencer to do all of this work is his ability to develop relationships and collaborations with local stakeholders that range from landowners to conservation NGOs. So today, Spencer is going to share some of his insights from his work on bridging ecology and communities to advance tropical forest restoration. So please help me welcome Spencer.
Thank you, Sebastián. Can everybody hear me okay? Coming through on the microphone? Okay, muchas gracias por los que se han conectado en línea, acompañar a nosotros. I'm going to go ahead and just start with a little brief background of my own. So throughout my history as a young naturalist growing up here in the Midwest, as well as throughout all my travels, there's kind of been one central idea that's motivated a lot of my study, and that is, if you build it, will they come? And this idea refers to how the introduction of habitat and other resources into landscapes affects the flora and fauna that live there. Now, plants are at the very center of this question, so I'm very excited to be here with you today at the Botanical Garden to talk to you about my experience. Before we get started, I'm going to give you a little bit of a roadmap for some of the topics that I'm going to talk about. After getting through a brief introduction, I'm going to feature my experience from 3 different projects, the first being my PhD work on avian seed dispersal in the Dominican Republic, and 2 projects from my postdoctoral studies, the first of these being long-term restoration experiments from Costa Rica, and the second of those being global analysis of practices by NGOs across the world. And then finally, I want to pull together some of the ideas learned from these projects to reflect on how I might use this experience going forward with a position at the Botanical Garden, as well as a broader outlook for how to translate research into effective conservation practice. So I think many in this room will relate to me when I say that this is both a depressing but also a very exciting time to be working in restoration. On the one hand, we've already lost so much ground. Only about 1/5 of the world's historic old-growth forests remain to this day. And we're no longer talking about preventing climate change, but are much more now instead in a state of damage control or mitigation. But despite these challenges, there's so much work in conservation that we can and must be doing to help to build resilience for both ecological and human communities alike. Thankfully, the public is waking up to some of these crises and these challenges ahead of us, as we've seen unprecedented commitments from the international community to take on these challenges, such as the UN's declared decade on ecosystem restoration, as well as multiple international initiatives from the public and private sector to plant more than 1 trillion trees in the coming years. Plants provide or offer increasingly an attractive option as a nature-based climate solution and those to other environmental problems, such as biodiversity conservation, improving, again, the resiliency of communities, and providing other ecosystem services as we adapt to these conditions. But one of the big questions is whether or not we can deliver on these promises. So one of the pieces of good news is that when we look at tropical forests, these systems do exhibit some characteristics that express their resiliency in the face of disturbance. So over the last several decades, there's plenty of evidence that shows that millions of hectares of secondary forests have been recovered through a combination of natural regeneration following land use change, in addition to more active reforestation tactics. However, the unfortunate reality is that we still do see net decreases and decline in overall forest cover in these regions. And this is due both to the continued loss of old growth forest, as well as the destruction of these newly regenerated secondary forests. So these and many other studies indicate that we need to do better on both of these fronts to be successful. As a scientist, I like to think about the problem of conservation as requiring key action in multiple tiers to bridge knowledge of ecosystems to broader societal needs. So we have our foundations in ecological studies. These are our various building blocks, our disciplines within this area of botany, zoology, evolutionary studies, and others. And we actually have to take this knowledge to strengthen the tool set of decision makers, as well as conduct applied research to be able to determine which of these outcomes or which of these implementations will give us the best results. And then finally, we need to identify which are these successful models for restoration and other concerns and scale these up to achieve broader impacts. So these are very big umbrellas for different topics that we all may be doing, but today I'm just going to show you 3 different projects that highlight my work in each of these areas and how I can build upon those in the future. The first of these is, as I mentioned, seed dispersal studies in the Dominican Republic, or restoration experiments, and the global NGO tree practices. So these little icons will reflect that throughout the talk, which one I'm on. As promised, we open with seed dispersal. So one of the particular qualities of tropical forests, particularly in the neotropics and humid forests, is the prevalence of animal seed dispersal. And this is evidenced in that in many cases we see upwards of 80 to 90% of the community of trees that show adaptation for attracting vertebrate seed dispersers through their production of fleshy fruits. And so these dispersal relationships are potentially key for several life history processes with plants related to dispersal, such as colonizing new unoccupied spaces, particularly interesting for restoration, as well as moving away from crowded conditions that are otherwise difficult for growing in densely populated spaces, and in some cases also delivery of propagules to very specific conditions that are required for propagation and growth. Now, my first entry into seed dispersal was actually in temperate forests, and specifically those that are dominated by oaks. And one of the things that I was interested in these initial experiences was how the interannual variability of resources, specifically masting, so oaks' tendency to produce different acorn crops across years, and how this reproductive modes and variability affects the behavior of scatter hoarding animals and seed dispersers. But one of the things that we think about in terms of phenology is actually when we look at temperate systems, we often see these very singular peaks and annual patterns. But in tropical forests, we have extended growing conditions under which a variety of reproductive models modes are exhibited, and there's potentially seed dispersal and fruiting happening throughout the year. So I became interested in how the seasonality of tropical forests would dictate relationships between seed dispersers and plants. And so this question brought me to the Dominican Republic. I actually originally came to know this area through an internship through Cornell University with a number of ornithologists who were interested in studying this endemic woodpecker species here, the Hispaniolan woodpecker. And one of the cool things about this bird is that it actually has this habit of nesting colonially in these sprawling royal palm savannas that are very typical of the agropastoral landscapes of this country. And however, while most of the people on this project were very much looking up at these birds, I found myself more often looking toward the ground. And the reason for that is that these birds, by nature of them frequently visiting these isolated structures out in agricultural areas, produces a very impressive seed rain. And so I began to contemplate how this seed dispersal in agricultural landscapes could have an impact on regeneration of forests in these disturbed environments. And I was also, determined to to take these studies to the next level in any project that I would be able to develop with them. And these ambitions led me to join up with Dr. Eric Walters at Old Dominion University as a PhD student. And I used my previous experience in the Dominican Republic to coordinate with a number of different local partners that came to support this project going forward, those being Plan Yaque, the Watershed Conservancy, Ecotourism Lodge, Rancho Baiguate, and a bit of help as well from the Jardín Botanical Nacional. Now, I also set to work in raising funds with a barrage of proposals for small grants. I want to in particular highlight here the Ruford Foundation and Birds Caribbean, since they awarded me multiple grants that were really critical for me maintaining the continuity of this project over its lifespan, as well as hiring several locally trained biologists. And here is some of our team here that I'm showing you. We had a very diverse set of contributors, of technicians and volunteers that were involved with this project over its lifespan. In particular, I want to highlight Juan Miguel Liberata, whose name is cut off there, unfortunately. So Juan Miguel is an ecologist trained locally at the Universidad ISA in Santiago, one of the larger cities also in the neighboring province. And so Juan Miguel was critical in assisting with leadership of this project over its lifespan, in that I had to return to my university several times for teaching and other obligations. So we benefited greatly from his services, as well as from our cooperation with a number of different private landowners and farmers, including their families, since our work was done exclusively on private lands. I want to start today in talking about this species here, Guarea guidonia. So this was a species that I originally became aware about through its relationship with the woodpeckers. So the woodpeckers, this is one of the most prominent food sources when it's in season, and it displays a very interesting reproductive pattern that both it and its close relatives are known to flower and reproduce frequently throughout the year. So they'll actually have these episodic reproductive patterns. And I was interested in using this as a potential model system for looking at how phenology affects seed dispersal relationships. So we set to work monitoring this species, and specifically a focal population in our first study site where we examined these patterns, looking at flowering and fruit phenology. So I'm showing you here a graph of the 18 months over which we initially monitored this population, and two separate graphs of blooming flowers and ripe fruits. So the lines here that I'm showing you show the proportion of trees that we were studying that exhibited these characteristics. And so as we can see, we do find this episodic blooming pattern here, that there are multiple peaks throughout a single year. But this didn't really translate to the same effect on fruiting, but instead had a single gradual extended ripe fruit phase, over which the cohorts of fruits maturing from these flowers, the capsules that are produced after the fruit set, open to dehisce and display these red aerated seeds that the birds are dispersing. And so we set to work as we were recording these phenology observations on getting some data on the feeding interactions. So looking at the birds that were coming to these trees and dispersing the seeds. And so as fruits were detected on these trees, we would subject them to observations, in addition to monitoring several local variables, including bird abundance and fruit abundance, to determine how birds were responding to the resource availability in this environment. And in addition to these local variables, we also looked at landscape level patterns of seed rain to see what was happening beyond this smaller scale of observation. We found some pretty unexpected results here. What I'm showing you here is a blue line that indicates the relative frequency of feeding at these Guarea trees with a shaded confidence interval there. And the red dotted line shows the relative abundance of ripe fruits on the focal trees in this population. And you can note that there's a bit of a mismatch here. So which ones? Okay, so there's a mismatch between these two lines in that the highest point of fruiting in this population, its peak, actually corresponds to the lowest foraging that we observe during the season. And as it so happens, date more than any of the other local variables that we were measuring were driving this process. So what could be so important about date, you might ask? Here I'm showing the seed trap data, so the months of this fruiting season along the bottom, and the relative densities of seeds falling into our traps. And this solid line shows us those Guarea seeds that we were finding in our traps. Once again, the dotted line shows us the relative abundance in the landscape from our focal study. And you can see that it corresponds, just like the graph before it, to this sort of seasonal depression in the middle of that peak, where we have otherwise higher feeding in the earlier part of the season, and as well as the later part of the season. And it turns out that this actually corresponds very closely to the emergence of other fruit resources that these birds were eating in this landscape, in particular of the genera Ocotea and Cupania. So once these fruits became available, birds were apparently switching to the other resource. And so this case of dispersal competition provides a kind of a unique perspective into how the evolutionary context of phenology may be related to interactions with seed dispersers. After having observed these very complex situations or multi-species problems, we developed the tools to tackle this kind of complexity. And so I scaled up my study to consider the full community of birds and plants in these systems via a network approach. So just to give a little bit of background, mutualistic networks, much like food webs, give us an ability to map out the interactions between different groups of animals and plants to make some inferences about how communities function as a whole, as well as how individual species contribute to the system's processes, such as frugivory and seed dispersal. And so we expanded from our original study site to an additional 5 communities, or 5 areas of about 25 hectares, and monitored these communities over the course of 12 full months to capture the full annual phenology of plant fruit production, as well as birds and their foraging. This effort resulted in a very large data set that I'm showing you a little bit about here, and this is a little bit crazy, so I just want to distill it for you here. This is a mutualistic network that is aggregated across the entire regional network. We see up here in red rectangles the bird species, and in the green rectangles below the plant species, the fruit that are giving fruits. And the connections between them represent the interaction frequency between those species. And so this is a very complex picture, and I'm not going to share everything from this particular project with you here today, but I want to take away some of the broader conclusions from this, as well as to show you some interesting metrics that we examined. One of the things that we can learn from this kind of data set is, first kind of I'm showing you up here, the degree value of each of this associated with each of these species. And that's just a fancy way of saying the number of mutualistic partners that a bird or plant has. And this reflects their propensity for generalism. So it may actually indicate those that have plants, for example, that show a greater number of mutualistic partners that are birds, potentially support a broader diversity of animals feeding on that resource. And so they potentially present keystone resources in these ecosystems. And we can examine that concept a little bit further through various other metrics that we develop from this, which is the first of which here is strength. So this actually represents the quantitative contribution of each species to the other community. So how dependent are those species based on their interaction frequency or proportion of that interaction to a particular species. And so what I want to just point out here is that we only have about 4 or 5 birds in this system that are contributing to the vast majority of seed dispersal interactions. So the biggest one of those is the palm chat, Dulis dominicus, which is an endemic bird to the island. And actually the woodpecker is in a close third, I think, there in that metric. But what I want to point out is that we have a much more even distribution in terms of how plants are contributing to the avian community. But we can actually take this a step further and say, okay, what happens when we adjust these metrics, for example, for abundance? Which are the species that give greater impact to the other assemblage that accounts for this? So this versatility measure here is actually from a temporal analysis, a multi-layer analysis over which we examine how species interactions turn over across different periods within the year. And specifically with this, we're interested in which of those species that connect their mutualistic partners between those periods, so provide a component of temporal stability. And one of the cool things that we find from this is that actually one of the biggest things determining this is the fruit phase. So those plant species that are providing fruits for over longer periods of time are really keeping birds active within the site in foraging on fruits, be they of the focal resource or potentially other resources that are adjacent to those in the community. And some examples of these kind of very generalist and phenologically important taxa in our system include Cecropia, the genus Cecropia, Clusia, as well as Roystonea palms, which are very common in that environment as well. And one of the key deliverables from this kind of information is that we can potentially take information from these ecological data to make more informed decisions about how to integrate native species into restoration contexts. So over the course of this study, we were propagating a lot of these seeds by kind of my initiative or desire to get more information about their species identification from seed and so forth. So in the process of studying them, we created our own little nursery that we were tending to for a couple of years. But once these, actually there were dozens of species from that list that I mentioned that are represented here. But once these began to outgrow us and these little seedlings grew up, I had to sever my emotional attachment to them and go ahead and pass them on over to our local partners, Planyake. So we delivered these to their nursery where they continued, and I also gave a couple of talks related to how these species could be integrated into restoration systems to better manage for wildlife and give those projects a better chance of long-term success in integrating more ecological function into their plan. Some of these projects have since been implemented, although they're very modest in scale. This is something that I'm really interested in continuing to work on and would like to engage with other people about, if they see potential for regions where they've worked to plant native species and to take this information into account. So some of those hopes, as it so happens, would be have been answered recently. As I've, with my postdoctoral projects, I moved on to the University of California, Santa Cruz to work on some long-term restoration experiments with my team there, who I can feature a little bit here from one of our most recent sampling visits. In particular, sorry for the cutoff there, it looks like the text shrunk, but this is the co-PIs here, Dr. Karen Hull, who's my supervisor currently as a postdoc, and Zach Zahawi of the Charles Darwin Foundation. And I also want to give a special mention to Juanabel Rosales and Federico Oviedo Brenes, cut off again. But these two resident biologists have been critical for our understanding the natural history and for their botanical expertise. And these four team members have been with the project since the beginning when it initiated in the mid-2000s. So I'm just going to be talking about some of the work that I've been contributing with this group today. One of the, basically the key problem that we have in tropical forest restoration is to take landscapes that look like this, degraded areas that have a long history of agriculture or other disturbances, perhaps cattle grazing in many cases, and to transform them back into healthy forests. So forests will recover naturally, and they often do, but one of the issues is that many of the processes that support natural succession are highly degraded in these environments. So in particular, we're talking about the absence of seed dispersal, so the ability for plants to colonize those environments, as well as how the microenvironment may or may not be amenable to the growth of various different species. So in order to ameliorate some of these barriers, tree planting is a potential solution to encourage and actually accelerate succession as we manage them. Little green, okay. Now, one of the interesting things about tropical systems and many other ecosystems is there's a tendency for these ecosystems to recover in sporadic nuclei that are spread across landscapes. So rather than in sort of large units, you do see that regeneration typically happens around remnant trees or other kinds of pioneer trees, perhaps, that have established in those environments. And this gives us some really important context, since this heterogeneous recovery in patches is potentially important for structuring biodiversity later on and may actually be more effective in promoting biodiversity than more intensively managed systems. So the Islas project from Costa Rica, as it's referred to for its use of tree islands, tests this very hypothesis and idea. And basically what we're looking at here is looking at comparing restoration model that uses small nuclei planting in comparison to more conventional restoration techniques like fully planted plantation grids, as well as natural regeneration conditions of simply letting the land recover on its own. And this has implications, of course, for the cost effectiveness of these different methods. So we want to know how this kind of restoration models might perform in the long term and how they match up to succession more generally. Once again, we got a little bit of a cutoff, but I'll get through this. So we have here just a layout of the experimental design from this system that I want to just quickly point your attention to the colors associated with each of these treatments that I'm showing you here. So natural regeneration here in orange is where no trees were planted at these replicate sites. Plantations were those that were fully planted with 4 species, those being 2 native hardwoods and 2 naturalized softwoods that are also nitrogen fixers. And the applied nucleation treatment implemented essentially about 1/5 of the planted area into 6 differently sized nuclei or islands. And this is a very long-going project in which there have been a number of different publications that address many different subjects within succession and restoration literature. However, I'm just going to be focusing today on some of my contributions that I've made since joining, as well as is focusing or emphasizing more so on the late successional processes of these systems. But from here, I just want you to understand that these restoration experiments overall had their intended effect in the production of canopies, and we do see that their patterns are very much matching to their initial treatment. So plantations develop these nice, tall, and contiguous forests, as we might expect from their fully planted array. Applied nucleation has recovery of canopy that is a little bit more heterogeneous, and natural regeneration is a little bit unpredictable, but does have considerable recovery of trees over this time frame of, if this shown here, about 12 to 15 years. And on the ground, let's see here. On the ground, things look a little bit like this. Once again, I'm going to keep bombarding you with these colors because they're going to become relevant later. But natural regeneration produces these very sort of weedy, grassy understories, but does have a fair number of pioneer trees that have established in and grown over the years. Applied nucleation, or I should actually start with plantation. Plantation has these nice, neat-looking forests with dense canopy cover, of course, and a very deep and rich litter layer on the ground. So applied nucleation is, as expected, somewhere in the middle of these two, where you have sort of differing conditions across the plot space. And it's fallen upon me as a postdoc to actually analyze some of the data from the first ever full census of these plots. So all along the lifespan of the project, there have been continuously sampled and recorded subplots within these to monitor tree growth and survival. However, I have been mainly involved with this part of the full survey, which is looking at the full sampling, as I mentioned, but of all the stems 20 centimeters and up, which here for convenience and also ecological inference, am dividing between seedlings, saplings, and trees. And this is a very rich data set of over 80,000 plant individuals from at least 250 tree species that we've identified. We'll start off with a quick summary of diversity here. Specifically, I'm showing you species richness communicated by species area curves. So on the y-axis, we see the number of species detected based on the area sampled. So as we sample more area, of course, we expect that we detect more species present in those systems. But in this case, there's a little bit of differences in the sampling area, so this gives us a moving line ability to compare those respective treatment groups. And what we generally find is we do see clear differences between the actively restored treatments and natural regeneration. So I'll indicate you once more to the lines. The orange is natural regeneration, light green is applied nucleation, plantation is in light blue, and the reference forests, which I haven't talked about yet, are those equivalent plots that we've sampled in nearby mature forests that give us an idea, an approximation of the species richness and composition that these communities may ultimately achieve. And what we see is that seedlings actually have, for those planted treatments, both of them, have reached species richness that is equivalent or similar to reference forests. However, they have not quite reached there in the sapling, yet they still have an advantage over the natural regeneration conditions. But when we move down all the way to trees, we see that actually up to this point, we still don't see a difference in the diversity of the natural recruits coming into these restored treatments. We haven't sampled them for long enough. This is at about approximately 18 to 20 years for reference for the longevity of this data. And most of these differences that we do observe in the collective data are actually driven by late successional species. So these late successional species, which are more typical of mature forests, actually represent about 2/3 of the total species pool, maybe a little bit less than that. And they are the most limited in our restored sites. So we're going to look a little bit at their patterns and learn some lessons, I guess, from their distribution. So we have here diversity displayed in a slightly different way. Rather than species richness, we're looking at species composition or relative abundance. And this is displayed through in ordination plots, specifically NMDS with Chow dissimilarity. And so what that means is that the points in this graph reflect when points are close together, they have a very similar composition, whereas when points are further apart, they have a much different composition. And this data, looking at it with respect to the dark blue, which is reference forests, gives us an idea of how the restored treatments are performing in comparison to those mature systems. And what we see is that with increasing planting effort, so that is from natural regeneration to the partially planted applied nucleation, all the way to the fully planted areas, we see increasing similarity of their understory communities to remnant forests. And while here we find, for example, in the seedlings, that there are points of all the treatments that have actually reached a composition similar to reference forests. However, the actual size of these confidence intervals here displayed in these shaded bands indicate that natural regeneration is much more variable. So where some are high performing, others are potentially taking successional trajectories that are much different than we'd expect from reference forests. Whereas the actively managed planted treatments are much more predictable in their successional trajectory. And then finally, the trees, similar before, this actually just reflects that they're dominated by the new recruits that are maturing, are a common suite of early successional species, so from the genera such as Miconia, Hampea, Heliocarpus, and several others, Cecropia, for example. Now, when we look a little bit further into the relative abundances of species within this late successional category, we see an interesting effect based on seed size. So here I'm showing you just seeds below 5 millimeters, between 5 and 10 millimeters, and above 10 millimeters. And one of the things that we see is that specifically with these late successional species is they are at much higher densities as you go into increasingly more densely planted plantations. So when you compare that to natural regeneration, these seeds of larger sizes are much more rare. And this reflects, basically overall, we can conclude that planting density does seem to facilitate taxa with larger seeds, these more dispersal limited, but possibly even shade adapted species. And we're just looking at that from a slightly different angle. These displays here are showing us the species composition, specifically the dominant species in these various treatments. And I want to focus your attention on the colors of the bars first, which are the relative abundance of these species shown along the x-axis. And you can see that with natural regeneration and applied nucleation, we have generally much lighter greens, which are early successional species, and the mid-greens, which are mid-successional. But in plantations, we're actually starting to see that in the sapling layer, those recruits that have achieved kind of greater size are beginning to dominate more so in the understory of these communities. And also the larger seed sizes as well, which are shown here along the indicators of these icons. We see that larger seed sizes are recruiting more so into the plantation sapling layer. And so one of the dynamics that's sort of underlying these trends that we're observing has to do with seed dispersal. Unfortunately, our data have been very limited in its ability to detect the seed dispersal of these larger propagules throughout the history of when we've sampled with seed traps in these plots. These large seeds have always been rare, so it's very hard to determine any kinds of patterns. But previous work from Leighton Reed, here formerly of the Botanical Garden, has shown that large-bodied frugivores such as Ramphastos toucans have been recorded throughout the history of these experiments, much more frequently in plantation areas, which could explain the dispersal advantage that we see from those seed sizes. But to tease apart the effects of seed dispersal and recruitment limitation, I'm currently going to be working with postdoc Miriam San Jose on an upcoming analysis that involves seed trap data that were recently collected over a 2-year period. So we're hoping to match up some of the data with the full survey to determine which are the most likely mechanisms explaining these trends. In conclusion, for this part here, I just want to kind of say, prior to this particular study that I've highlighted here, very much we've seen similar patterns between applied nucleation and plantation treatments. So this is one of the new findings from this has been that actually plantations do seem to be facilitating some of these late successional species. So this can have implication for how we might manage these systems, whether or not something like applied nucleation would need to be enriched with further maybe transplants if their practitioners are using this, or potentially seeding these environments. There's been a number of tests of this throughout different systems. But I also just want to highlight here that one of the kind of the unknowns at this point is whether these understory communities will go on to mature and actually represent these forests in the future via longer term succession. So. Finally, I'm going to cover my third area of research here, which is global tree growing campaigns. So specifically, we're investigating practices by private organizations across the world with respect to their trees. So I'm sure that everybody in this room at some point has seen online via social media or other browsing, been bombarded by these kinds of messages soliciting donations to plant trees, or buy a tree for a loved one, sponsor a tree, kind of all of these messages, as well as offsetting your carbon footprint, and the list goes on from there. But while trees do make many legitimate promises toward solving environmental issues, there's a risk with many of these same objectives of going the other way. So, for example, when we talk about planting trees, these may actually compete with productive use, or with people for productive use of land, and may actually ultimately harm communities, as well as the potential for, in afforestation situations, displacing native grasslands or other vulnerable ecosystems like wetlands. And finally, just kind of thinking about this more critically, any case of restoration failure is a potential threat to conservation and restoration efforts more generally, since it undermines the ability for trees to actually solve these environmental problems. So getting it right is super important, and we should be very focused on these issues. But some of the tools to address these kind of problems do, in fact, exist. So in recent years, there have been a number of different guidelines that have been published based on restoration science and ecologists in determining what are the best practices or issues to circumvent in restoration management that we should be focusing on. So these include things such as, are organizations simply putting trees in the ground and walking away? Or do they have defined project standards about where they work, why they work, and other commitments as related to whether they have objectives that are time-bound and measurable over the long term for the trees to deliver the intended benefits, as well as their potential commitments to local communities and the long-term funding and security of those spaces, since we know from earlier that destruction of secondary forest is a huge threat to forest management overall. And so through my connection here at UC Santa Cruz, Dr. Karen Hull and I recruited a group of interested students to take on these kinds of questions. And this project involved the online surveys of some of the biggest international tree growing organizations operating globally on a global scale. And specifically, once again, we were using online reporting to get at some of these questions about what organizations are doing, what might be the limitations of this work, and the challenges going forward. Now, these organizations that I mentioned, they are specifically of this kind of organizational model that we refer to as intermediary organizations. And so these can be a variety of different models, for example, charities operating based on donations and grants, as well as businesses that are attracting investors and possibly even distributing, or I should say brokering, carbon credits. But the one thing uniting these 99 organizations that we selected is this aspect of their model in which they route funding, whatever its source is, to networks of local partners across the world. And this kind of model has been growing increasingly in the recent decades, with many of these organizations emerging just in the last 20 or 30 years. And as we might expect, most of these organizations are located in either North America or Europe, although we do have some others from around the world, but about 80 to 90% of them are actually sort of in higher income countries. And to give some of the takeaways here first, we developed a best practices index, as we call it here, which is essentially a scorecard from 22 checklist items about organizational practice that correspond to 10 broader themes, such as the ones that I mentioned on the previous slide related to project standards, longevity of funding commitments, incorporation of locals, and other measures. But what we see from this, from our broader view of this, is that the more experienced organizations, here quantified by the number of trees that organizations claim to have planted, does relate or actually correspond to higher best practices indexed by our measures. So these organizations are reporting more robust information, for example, about their use of native species or in potentially exotic species in their various programs, as well as their broader organizational structure and how they're related to their implementing group that is around part of their network, right? So you do see also that there's a little bit of a drop off here. So some of these less experienced organizations perhaps don't report as much information, which may have to do with their lower scope of projects, where some of them may not have been fully completed yet, but also we do see from this an indication that organizations may be adjusting their methodology in conforming to best practices recommendations over time, which is an encouraging sign. Now, I'm just going to break down some pieces of this best practice index that I feel like are going to be relevant to this audience. But some of the, we've been hearing, I heard there's a great talk yesterday about the use of locals in restoration projects. So one of the things that we did look at was local engagement via the programs administered by these intermediary organizations. And what we do find is that, as expected, most of the local involvement that organizations are reporting are in this implementation phase. So that is typically participatory action in tree planting activities directly when projects begin. However, we see much more variation in just how many organizations are engaging people in the preparatory phases, that being goal setting for the projects as well as planning, such as project selection, site selection rather, in these later post implementation phases, such as commitments to monitoring and stewardship. And I should say that these organizations, actually 100% of them, so every single one of them, highlighted specific objectives that they had for locals to benefit from the projects. And only about 38% of these actually substantiated these, however, with quantitative data. So then we have, what's my time? 18 minutes, perfect, thank you. So that will help me get through this. But so we have here a display of long-term commitments. So we wanted to look at how organizations commit to the projects over this period. We find that most organizations fall into one of these first two categories, which is that they are either not showing exactly what they're doing, or they simply leave it up to the local decision makers to determine their own programs. But we do see that that there are much fewer organizations that actually explicitly require programs to last more than 5 to 10 years, or up to 10 years. I'm going to skip that part. So one of the things emerging from this is not only that's very promising, is that we've actually been contacted by a number of these organizations to follow up with us about how they can improve their reporting and practices, and as displayed by the reports. And the next steps of this project will actually come from a proposal potentially that we just submitted to connect these practices to actual outcomes in the field by cooperating with Restore and as a platform to look at forest cover change over time with a sample of projects from these different organizations. Now that I've told you about where I've been, I want to tell you a little bit about where I'm going. So, of course, I'm very determined to continue my investigations of seed dispersal in a restoration context, and think there's a lot of potential here to collaborate with others at the Garden on these kinds of initiatives. And as well as a new area that I'm really interested in moving into is looking more so at these things that I mentioned earlier from my PhD of how to integrate native species into restoration settings, and how tree management more generally has impacts and co-benefits for wildlife and people, and how we can measure these dynamics from these projects to improve them. And so, seeing that I've only been with the Islas project here in Costa Rica for a little more than a year now, I'm definitely very favorable about continuing collaboration with them. One of the things that's kind of limiting in these restoration kinds of experiments is that most of the work that's been done so far actually considers how the local landscape and conditions predict the success of restorations on the small scale. However, I'm very interested in looking at how these communities that I mentioned, these recruiting native species into these forests, when they begin to produce fruits of their own, how do the interactions between those fruits and seed dispersals recover over time, so we can understand better how these management techniques correspond to the recovery of ecosystem functions like seed dispersal and other plant-animal interactions. And, okay. Then the other thing I want to mention is, much as I did during my PhD, I would be interested in scaling up this kind of work to the next level. And this summer I will be attending, or actually contributing to, a restoration workshop, a lecture as part of a broader field conservation or botanical conservation course led by OSA Conservation and partners. And one of the really cool things that I found out about this project as I began to learn about it is that OSA Conservation is leading some very interesting restoration work right now on that they refer to as the reef to ridge restoration model. And they are using voluntary farmers for tree planting to accomplish restoration. And so I want to see if I can maybe join up with them and explore opportunities for integrating ecological information such as seed dispersal relationships into this, as well as potentially other cultural values of trees and their benefits to people. And if it's not obvious by now, I'm a big proponent of working and conducting research and conservation in the places where people are living and working. So as I've expressed throughout this talk, we need buy-in from both the public and locals to be able to have success in restoration. And so there's a number of different projects that I am interested in pursuing, but I'm going to tell you about just one of them here at the end. And that is, I know that the Botanical Garden here has a lot of background, a lot of experience working in central Peru specifically. So as it so happens, I've not been to Peru. Last year I was exploring a potential fellowship opportunity with my colleague here, Dr. Ruth Bennett, who manages the bird-friendly coffee at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center. The bird-friendly coffee focuses on using native shade trees and coffee systems to achieve co-benefits for people and wildlife, specifically by using those ecological indicators that I mentioned related to resource use by birds and insects, for example, as well as relating this to information that we can collect from locals about what are the prospective benefits of these trees for the community and for integration, again, into production systems such as coffee. And I think there's also some very promising work that can be done, as well as pursuing conventional research and conservation grants, actually appealing to some of the supply chain, the international coffee roasters that are actually associated with these coffee growing organizations. So to actually incorporate private sector funding into achieving both research and economic development. And now here at the end, I just want to remind us of some of the things that we talked about today. So my priorities going forward will be to continue to investigate seed dispersal in restoration systems to understand how to manage these systems for greater resiliency and greater function of these core ecological processes, as well as using this research to enrich ongoing restoration programs and identifying new potential areas where restoration could be conducted. And finally, using each of these as a potential to train and mentor scientists along the way. This has been a very key part of my experience throughout my career so far, is having a positive effect on other scientists, and it's something that's really kept me in this game. So I'm very excited about the potential to bring these to the Missouri Botanical Garden and see a lot of reason to be optimistic going forward. I want to go ahead and thank you all here for coming to my talk, and I would open it now to any questions.